They say the dead don't speak, but sometimes they leave echoes loud enough to change a life. On a cold November night, inside a quiet cemetery, one act of kindness would uncover a truth buried for 25 years. And by morning, nothing would ever be the same again. November 25, 2025. 7 o'clock in the evening. Oakwood Cemetery, Memphis, Tennessee. Grace Williams stood at the tall iron gates, the cold keys heavy in her palm as she prepared to lock up for the night. The air had that sharp, metallic bite that came just before winter fully claimed the city, and she pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders as she glanced back across the grounds one last time. 8 years. That's how long she'd worked here as a groundskeeper. 8 years of tending to the quiet residents she liked to think of as simply sleeping. Before that, she'd spent 20 years as a nurse, her hands trained to save the living instead of caring for the dead. Some people found the change strange. Grace never did. This place wasn't about death to her. It was about memory, about promises that didn't fade just because someone was gone. Her boots followed the familiar gravel path through Section C, past ancient oak trees whose roots cracked the earth like old scars. She stopped in front of a simple granite headstone, worn but clean. Catherine Ann Pierce, 1964-2000. Beloved mother and sister. Grace bent down slowly and placed a fresh white rose against the stone, her fingers lingering there for a moment. She did this every week. Had done it for 25 years without fail. "Good night, Katie," she whispered. "I miss you, sister." The words stayed close to her heart. Few people knew that a black woman and a white woman had grown up as sisters in 1970s Memphis. Some bonds were too sacred to explain. Grace took a few steps to the right, stopping at a marker that barely qualified as one. No name, just a county number etched into stone. John Doe, number 247. "Rest easy, Tommy," she said quietly. Grace knew exactly who lay there. Thomas Michael Pierce, Catherine's husband. A good man once, before grief and alcohol broke him down piece by piece. 3 years earlier, she'd found him sleeping rough inside the cemetery, deliberately letting the cold claim him less than 20 feet from his wife's grave. She'd taken him home, fed him, given him warmth and dignity for 15 months until his heart finally failed in March of 2023. He'd died holding her hand, apologizing to people who weren't there anymore. Grace straightened, the ache in her knees familiar now, when the sound of an engine cut through the quiet. Headlights swept across the stones. Her brow furrowed. The cemetery was closed. She turned toward the entrance just as a black Tesla slipped through the open gates before she could lock them. The car rolled slowly down the path and stopped directly in front of John Doe 247's grave. Grace stayed back near an oak tree, watching. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out. Even in the dim lamplight, she could tell he was young, maybe mid-30s. He wore a tailored suit that probably cost more than most people made in a month, but it hung on him like he hadn't slept in days. He reached back into the car and pulled out a bottle. Bourbon. Expensive. He dropped to his knees in front of Thomas's grave, twisted the cap, and drank straight from it. His shoulders began to shake. "Why?" His voice cracked, raw and broken. "Why did you have to die like this?" He drank again, deeper this time, his body swaying. Grace recognized the signs instantly. 20 years in emergency rooms taught you when someone had gone too far. She stepped forward. "Sir, are you?" He turned toward her voice, eyes glassy and unfocused, and then his body gave out. He fell sideways, his head striking the granite marker with a sickening crack. The bottle shattered. Blood streamed down his face. Grace ran. Her legs protested, but instinct overruled pain. She dropped beside him, fingers finding his neck. A pulse. Weak, but there. His breathing was shallow, the smell of bourbon overpowering. "Sir, can you hear me?" She pulled out her phone and dialed 911, her voice steady despite the fear clawing up her spine. Oakwood Cemetery, Section C. Male, mid-30s, head trauma, possible alcohol poisoning. She pressed her scarf against the gash on his temple, tilted his head to keep his airway clear. 8 minutes later, an ambulance tore through the gates, red and blue lights slicing through the darkness. 2 EMTs jumped out, bags in hand. "Do you know him?" one asked as they worked. Grace spotted a wallet near the broken glass and picked it up carefully. Tennessee license. Jonathan Pierce. 35. The name meant nothing to her. Pierce was common. She'd known dozens. I found him like this, she said. He collapsed. You saved his life, the EMT told her as they loaded Jonathan onto the stretcher. Another hour out here and he wouldn't have made it. Grace watched the ambulance disappear, the wallet heavy in her hand. She set it gently on Thomas's headstone so it wouldn't be lost and stared down at the grave. Why were you visiting him, Tommy? She whispered. Tire tracks scarred the damp earth. Old ones. He'd been here before. More than once. She locked the gates and drove home to her small Cooper Young house, exhaustion settling into her bones. That night, she pulled an old photo album from the bottom drawer of her dresser. The first picture showed a white woman with kind eyes holding a black baby. Eleanor Pierce and baby Grace, 1967. Next, two teenage girls laughing with arms around each other. Catherine and Grace, 1979. Then Catherine, pregnant and glowing. Then a newborn baby in Grace's arms. Baby Jonathan, a little boy holding her hand. Jonathan and Aunt Gracie, 1995. The last photo showed a 10-year-old boy with a gap-toothed grin. You'd be 35 now, Grace whispered. Catherine had died when Jonathan was 10. His grandmother had taken him to Nashville. Grace had searched for him for years. Letters returned. Calls unanswered. A private investigator eventually found traces of him. MIT, a tech company, success. Alive. She'd told herself that had to be enough. She closed the album, unaware that the man she'd saved hours earlier was the boy she'd been searching for all along. 1 week later, Jonathan Pierce sat in his Tesla outside the cemetery gates, engine running. His head still throbbed faintly from the stitches. The doctor's lecture about alcohol poisoning echoed in his ears. He should go in. He should thank the woman who saved him. The hospital had given him her name. Grace Williams. But gratitude came with questions, and questions came with truths he wasn't ready to face. He turned off the engine anyway and stepped out, carrying 2 bouquets of white roses. He walked to Section C and knelt before his mother's grave. I'm sorry, he whispered. I should have come back sooner. He placed the roses, then turned to the unmarked grave beside hers. I should have looked for you, Dad. Mr. Pierce. Jonathan froze. A woman stood nearby, pruning shears in hand. She was kind-faced, late 50s, with silver threading her hair. You're the man from last week, she said gently. I'm glad you're all right. Thank you, he replied quickly. I'm John. Grace smiled. Nice to meet you, John. And as he walked away, the lie burned heavier than the guilt he'd carried for 25 years. Jonathan told himself he wouldn't come back, yet 3 days later he found himself walking the same gravel path with 2 cups of coffee warming. His hands. Grace was trimming hedges near Catherine's grave when she noticed him. Morning, Grace, he said, holding out a cup. She looked surprised, then pleased. That's very kind of you, John. They sat on a bench beneath the oak trees, steam rising between them. Jonathan didn't know they were sitting 20 feet from his mother. You come here often? Grace asked. Yes, he said, to see people who mattered to me. Grace nodded, not pushing. Family, he swallowed. I think so. It's complicated. Most families are, she said softly. Something about her tone loosened something inside him. He found himself talking more than he'd meant to. Not details, just feelings. Regret, estrangement, loss. Grace listened without judgment, the way good nurses did. Why are you so kind to strangers? He asked suddenly. Because everyone deserves kindness, she replied. Especially people carrying pain. He started coming back 2 or 3 times a week after that. Coffee, pastries, small talk about weather and birds and the history of the cemetery. Grace laughed at his dry jokes. He relaxed in a way he hadn't in years. Neither of them knew the truth yet, but Grace was beginning to feel something stir in her chest. Patterns. White roses. The way he traced Catherine's name with reverent fingers. His watch. His car. A phone call she overheard once. Mr. Pierce, the board meeting. his hesitation when she asked his age. 35. Catherine's son would be 35. One evening, Grace sat at her kitchen table, tea going cold as the pieces slid together. "Oh, Katie," she whispered. "Is it you?" She pulled the cemetery files the next morning. Catherine Ann Pierce. Son, Jonathan Michael Pierce. She pulled Thomas's file. Estranged from son. Grace drove home shaking. At home, she held the old photo up to the light and compared it to the man she'd been sharing coffee with. The eyes. The tilt of the head. "It's you," she said aloud. She decided not to rush him. Love couldn't be forced. She began leaving gentle hints, telling stories about losing someone like a son, about chosen family, about promises made long ago. Jonathan listened but didn't hear it yet, too buried in his own guilt. In early January, he asked her to dinner. Grace invited him into her home, fed him fried chicken and collard greens, watched him eat like someone who'd forgotten what care tasted like. He noticed the photos on her walls. Eleanor Pierce. Catherine. Grace told him about a white woman who chose love over fear in 1967. He told her about a mother who loved white roses. They circled the truth without touching it. That night, Grace wrote a letter she didn't know when she'd give him, pouring 25 years of love and loss onto paper. She folded it and placed it in the box with the photos, whispering a prayer for timing. February came cold and bright. On the 15th, Grace woke with a headache she tried to ignore. She planted tulip bulbs anyway. Jonathan arrived with coffee, noticed her pallor. "Grace, are you okay?" "Just tired," she said. He hesitated, hands shaking. "I need to tell you something." She turned toward him, heart pounding. "My name isn't." The world tilted. Grace clutched her chest, her words slurring, her left side going slack. Jonathan caught her as she fell, screaming for help, holding her as if he'd lose her if he let go. "Don't leave me," he begged. Her right hand found his face, weak but sure. "My boy," she whispered. The ambulance came fast. "Are you family?" an EMT asked. "Yes," Jonathan said without hesitation. "I'm her nephew." And for the first time in decades, the word felt true. The surgery lasted 5 hours. Jonathan sat in the waiting room, memories colliding, fear clawing his chest. When the doctor finally emerged and said she'd live, Jonathan cried openly. That night, he went to her house to find her papers and found the box instead. Photos. His childhood. Her letter. The truth he'd been running from. He read until dawn, sobbing, understanding at last that he'd never been abandoned. Back in the ICU, he held her hand and told her everything. "I'm not hiding anymore," he whispered. "I'm home." And when her fingers squeezed his, he knew she heard him. 6 months after the night everything changed, Lucia Vega paused outside the boardroom doors, her reflection faintly visible in the glass. The woman staring back still looked like her. Same dark eyes, same calm mouth, but the weight she carried had shifted. It was no longer the burden of invisibility. It was responsibility. Inside, voices murmured, papers shuffled, chairs scraped softly across the polished floor. Once, those sounds had belonged to a world that excluded her. Now they marked a space where her presence mattered. Lucia adjusted the folder in her hands, feeling the familiar reassurance of the jade pen resting against her palm, and stepped inside. The room rose to greet her. Board members stood without being prompted, a gesture that still surprised her no matter how many times it happened. "Good morning," she said, first in English, then Spanish, then Mandarin, the words flowing easily, naturally. Heads nodded, smiles followed. 6 months earlier, she had been wiping fingerprints from this very table, absorbing conversations never meant for her. Today, she was here to lead them. She took her seat and glanced briefly at the framed photograph on the far credenza. Her father, younger than she remembered him now, caught mid-laugh in an old snapshot from his early days at Reeves Enterprises. Rafael Vega had believed in preparation, in quiet excellence, in bridges built word by word. Lucia inhaled and began. Her presentation unfolded with clarity and precision. Market expansion strategies grounded in cultural nuance. Labor retention models informed by first-hand experience. Numbers that spoke the board's native language. profit margins, growth percentages, reduced turnover, interwoven with the human cost those numbers often obscured. Since the Hangtech partnership, Asian market share had grown 32%. Employee retention was up 24%. The room listened, rapt, not because Lucia demanded attention, but because she had earned it. She spoke without bravado, her confidence measured, grounded. When she referenced workforce protections, she didn't moralize. She explained risk mitigation, long-term stability, brand trust, the arithmetic of fairness. Victor Reeves watched her closely from the head of the table, his expression unreadable. He had not changed, not really. Profit still drove him, but Profit had learned a new dialect, one Lucia spoke fluently. Outside the boardroom, the company was changing in ways few analysts noticed but many employees felt. Lucia's first official directive as director had been the creation of the Rafael Vega Scholarship Fund, open to the children of maintenance, security, and support staff, students whose talents were often buried beneath survival. Her second had been the Hidden Talents Initiative, a quiet but radical program encouraging employees at every level to disclose skills, education, and experience beyond their job descriptions. The results had been startling. A night security guard with an engineering degree from Nigeria now worked in product development. A cafeteria worker fluent in 5 languages joined the international logistics team. An IT help desk technician with an eye for design now sat in on early-stage product meetings. Lucia didn't frame it as charity. She framed it as efficiency. Untapped talent was wasted capital. Reeves understood that language perfectly. Lucia's own life had shifted just as profoundly. The eviction notice was gone, replaced by a lease for a modest 2-bedroom apartment near her mother's rehabilitation center. Min Vega's health had stabilized, her physical therapy progressing faster than doctors expected. In the afternoons, Min took online courses to refresh her engineering credentials, her mind as sharp as ever. Sometimes Lucia would catch her mother studying schematics at the kitchen table, determination etched into her features, and feel a quiet swell of pride. The hospital bills were under control. The debt shrinking. For the first time since her father's death, the future felt negotiable rather than foreclosed. Lucia's office reflected her journey without announcing it loudly. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city that had once swallowed her whole. The desk was solid walnut, smooth beneath her fingertips. On one corner sat the jade pen, resting in a small crystal stand, its surface catching the light. Nearby, a framed photo of her parents on their wedding day, Min radiant, Raphael grinning as if the world were already generous. Fresh orchids filled the room with a clean, living scent that mingled faintly with the sandalwood memory the pen always carried. Past and present coexisted here, not as contradiction, but as continuity. The business press loved her story. Headlines framed her rise as improbable, inspirational, disruptive. Analysts praised Reeves Enterprises for discovering hidden talent within its own ranks, calling it an innovative approach to diversity. Lucia read the articles with a practiced neutrality. They never quite captured the cost of invisibility, the exhaustion, the calculations made at 3 in the morning over eviction notices and medical bills. They didn't mention the dozens of others who had been overlooked for years. But they did mention Rafael Vega. That mattered. One clipping, framed beside her father's photo, read, Reeves Enterprises stock soars on Asian partnership, new director credits immigrant father's legacy. Lucia smiled every time she passed it, not because of the praise, but because his name was no longer a footnote. Derek Willis, meanwhile, had vanished from the corporate world with remarkable speed. After the security footage and internal investigation became impossible to ignore, his reputation collapsed. No major firm would touch him. The last Lucia heard, he was teaching business communication at a community college. The irony was sharp but unindulged. Lucia did not take pleasure in his fall. She simply refused to carry it. Reeves himself remained much the same, calculating, exacting, unapologetically driven by results. He referred to Lucia's ascent as lightning in a bottle, a phrase that neatly avoided acknowledging the systems that had kept her hidden. But his actions spoke louder than his metaphors. Hiring practices shifted, promotion pathways widened, Language access improved. Not out of moral awakening, perhaps, but because it worked. And working systems save lives quietly, without needing belief. As Lucia concluded her presentation, the board approved her expansion plan unanimously. 450 new jobs projected. 18% valuation growth anticipated. She closed her folder and rose. Applause followed, measured, professional, sincere. As the meeting adjourned, employees greeted her in the hallway. Some in English, others in Spanish or Mandarin. Each greeting felt like a small bridge, built and crossed in the same moment. Back in her office, her assistant knocked softly. "Your mother's physical therapist called," she said. "Improvements are ahead of schedule." "Gracias," Lucia replied, savoring the ease with which she spoke now, no longer editing herself for survival. Her calendar chimed, a reminder of another meeting, another chance to shape the company's direction. She picked up the jade pen, rolling it once between her fingers. It was no longer a secret. It was a symbol, not of exceptionalism, but of preparation, meeting opportunity at last. Lucia paused by the window, looking out over the city. She thought of the cleaning staff who now walked these halls with their heads a little higher. Of her mother, rebuilding a life interrupted but not erased. Of her father, whose lessons had carried her across an invisible line. Visibility had its price. Scrutiny, pressure, expectation, but invisibility had cost far more. Talent wasted, futures delayed, bridges left unbuilt. She turned back to her desk, to her work, to the future unfolding not by miracle, but by choice. Words still built bridges, and Lucia Vega intended to keep building. 2 years passed faster than Jonathan ever thought possible, not because life slowed down, but because it finally felt full. Grace turned 60 with a quiet dignity that came from surviving loss and choosing joy anyway. She walked without her cane most days now, her speech clear except for the slightest softness that only those who loved her noticed. She volunteered at Memphis General twice a week, sitting with new stroke patients in the same rooms where fear once lived inside her, telling them honestly that recovery was hard, slow, and worth every second. Jonathan drove her every time, even when she told him she could manage on her own. "Humor me," he'd say, smiling. "I waited 25 years. I'm not rushing anything now." The foundation grew steadily, not flashy, but real. Foster kids found apartments instead of streets. Elderly patients found advocates when paperwork got overwhelming. Families who didn't fit neat definitions found rooms where they belonged. Jonathan never put his face on the website. Grace insisted. "This isn't about credit," she said. "It's about staying." On November 25, 2027, exactly 2 years after the night Grace found Jonathan bleeding beside his father's grave, Oakwood Cemetery filled with people. The city had officially dedicated a new memorial section, funded quietly by Jonathan but named for the family who had taught him what legacy really meant. 4 headstones stood in a row surrounded by white rose bushes that bloomed even in cooler weather. Eleanor May Pierce. She chose love over fear. Catherine Ann Pierce. Sister. Mother. Light. Thomas Michael Pierce. He tried. He loved. He is forgiven. And 1 stone still waiting. Grace Eleanor Williams Pierce. Mother by choice. Family by love. Jonathan stood at the podium while Grace sat beside him, bundled in a coat, her eyes bright. 300 people gathered. Donors. Families helped by the foundation. Nurses. Stroke survivors. Foster kids grown tall. Jonathan cleared his throat, steadying himself. 2 years ago, I came here ready to disappear, he said. I had built a company but not a life. I had money, but no one to come home to. A woman I thought was a stranger saved my life that night. He paused, looking at Grace. What I didn't know was that she had been searching for me for 25 years. His voice caught, but he continued. My grandmother chose love when the world told her not to. My mother chose sisterhood when society said it was impossible. My aunt chose to search when giving up would have been easier. And I chose to stop hiding. He reached for Grace's hand. Family isn't who you're born to. Family is who stays, who forgives, who chooses you again and again. Grace stood slowly, steadying herself on the podium. I've lived through a lot of losing, she said. But I've learned something important. Love doesn't disappear. It waits. Sometimes for decades. And when it comes back stronger. She squeezed Jonathan's hand. 5 generations of choosing love. That's what this place honors. The applause lasted long enough that Grace had to sit back down, laughing through tears. That evening, after the crowd dispersed and the sun sank low, Jonathan and Grace sat together on the bench near the graves. The cemetery lights flickered on, soft and steady. "Do you ever regret the years we lost?" Grace asked quietly. Jonathan shook his head. "No, those years shaped us into who we needed to be. If I'd found you sooner, I wouldn't have been ready." Grace smiled. "That's the kindest thing you've ever said to your old mother." He laughed. "Get used to it." By Christmas Eve 2028, Grace's Cooper young house pulsed with warmth and noise it hadn't known in decades. Jonathan insisted on hosting there every year now. "This is home," he said. The table stretched wall to wall. 12 people squeezed together. Foster kids who'd aged out and stayed. Families the foundation supported. Friends who'd become permanent. Grace sat in her favorite chair by the fireplace, Kane resting nearby more out of habit than need. Jonathan pulled the ham from the oven, calling out, "Mom, mac and cheese." "5 minutes, baby," she replied. When they sat down, Jonathan raised his glass. "Mom, will you say the blessing?" Grace stood, steady and proud. "Thank you for second chances," she said. "Thank you for chosen family. Thank you for love that waits and never gives up." Around the table, people who shared no blood shared everything else. Laughter, stories, belonging. Jonathan caught Grace's eye and mouthed, "I love you." She smiled and mouthed back, "I love you too, baby." Outside, snow fell softly over Memphis for the first time in years. Inside, a family built by choice celebrated together. And in Oakwood Cemetery, 4 graves rested beneath white roses and quiet stars, bound not by blood, but by love that chose, waited, forgave, and finally came home.